The scream of twisted metal echoed through the underhive as something impossible descended from the darkness above. Not a drop pod, not an Imperial assault craft, but something far stranger. A figure fell through layers of corroded infrastructure, past generations of forgotten machinery, until finally crashing into the toxic sludge of the deepest levels with earth-shattering force. When the dust settled and the echoes faded, she stood, barely 5 feet tall. Her frame appeared delicate against the grotesque backdrop of Hive Tertius. But appearances in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium are always deceiving. Her chrome and carbon fiber body gleamed despite the filth around her. Her eyes, impossibly large and filled with ancient sadness, surveyed the hellscape before her with calculating precision. Alita had arrived in Warhammer 40,000. But here's what makes this crossover absolutely fascinating. We're not just dropping a cybernetic warrior into another universe. We're placing someone who represents hope, compassion, and the belief that life has inherent value into a reality where such concepts are considered dangerous heresies. The philosophical collision alone would reshape both characters and cosmos in ways that demand exploration. Today we're diving deep into this impossible scenario. What would happen if the last Panzer Kunst master found herself in the Imperium of man? How would her martial prowess stack against space marines and chaos champions? Could her unwavering moral compass survive in a galaxy where mercy is weakness and compassion invites corruption? By the end of this journey, you'll understand exactly why this matchup represents more than just another versus battle. It's an examination of what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object, when hope crashes headfirst into despair, when the future we fear to lose meets the future we fear to gain. The first thing we need to establish is just how catastrophically overpowered Alita would be in this universe. Her Panzer Kunst fighting style isn't just martial arts. It's a completely alien approach to combat that would leave even veteran Imperial soldiers questioning everything they thought they knew about warfare. Where Space Marines rely on overwhelming firepower and Orcs trust in brutal simplicity, Alita represents surgical precision elevated to an art form. Consider her signature technique, the Hertza Haeon. This isn't just a fancy punch. It's a strike that generates destructive vibrations through solid matter, literally tearing opponents apart from the inside out. Imagine a Chaos Space Marine in full Terminator armor, confident in ceramite plating that has deflected bolter rounds and power weapons for millennia, suddenly finding that armor becoming a liability as vibrations tear through metal and flesh with equal efficiency. But the technical superiority goes far beyond individual techniques. Alita's cybernetic body operates on principles that would make even the most advanced tech priests weep with envy and frustration. Her neural interface processes information at speeds that make even Astartes' reaction times seem sluggish. Her body can adapt and modify itself mid-combat, rerouting damaged systems and compensating for injuries that would cripple any other warrior. The Adeptus Mechanicus would simultaneously worship and fear her. Here's a being that represents the perfect fusion of flesh and machine they've spent 10,000 years trying to achieve, yet she operates without any of their sacred rituals or machine spirit appeasement. Her technology just works, consistently and reliably, in ways that would shatter their fundamental understanding of how the universe operates. Now let's talk about what makes this scenario truly explosive. Alita doesn't just fight differently, she thinks differently. In her world, individual life has value. Every person matters. These aren't abstract concepts for her, they're driving principles that guide every decision. Drop her into the Imperium of man, where individual lives are literally counted as acceptable losses in calculations measured by the millions, and you create an immediate ideological crisis. Picture this scene. Alita witnesses an Imperial Guard regiment receiving orders to hold a position knowing they'll all die just to buy time for a tactical withdrawal. In her universe, this would be unthinkable. There would be another way, a solution that saves everyone. But in Warhammer 40,000, this is Tuesday. The collision between her worldview and Imperial doctrine would create ripples throughout the command structure. She wouldn't just refuse such orders, she'd actively work to subvert them. Her speed and combat ability would allow her to single-handedly accomplish objectives that normally require entire companies of soldiers. Suddenly, those calculated acceptable losses become unnecessary. The mathematical certainty of Imperial warfare breaks down when one individual can reshape entire battlefields. The theological implications alone would send the ecclesiarchy into absolute chaos. Here's a being who demonstrates power that rivals Imperial saints, yet follows no Imperial creed. She shows mercy to enemies, protects the weak without regard for their station, and treats every life as sacred. These actions, performed by someone of obvious superhuman capability, would inevitably be interpreted as divine intervention by the masses. Imagine the propaganda nightmare this creates for Imperial authorities. How do you suppress a cult of personality around someone who's actively saving Imperial citizens? How do you maintain the grim necessity of Imperial doctrine when someone keeps proving there are alternatives? The very foundation of Imperial control rests on the belief that their harsh methods are the only way humanity can survive. Alita's existence would undermine that foundation simply by being herself. But the real nightmare scenario for the Imperium isn't her combat ability or even her ideological challenge. It's her adaptability. Alita learns, she evolves. She takes techniques from defeated opponents and incorporates them into her own fighting style. In a universe filled with diverse and deadly combat forms, from Eldar blade dancing to Orc brutal cunning, she would rapidly become something unprecedented. Consider what happens when she encounters her first Chaos Space Marine. The corrupted warrior expects to face another baseline human, someone who can be intimidated by raw presence and overwhelmed by superior strength. Instead, they find themselves against an opponent who moves like liquid mercury, strikes with impossible precision, and adapts to their fighting style within moments of engagement. The corruption aspect presents its own fascinating dynamic. Chaos feeds on emotion, on doubt, on the small compromises that gradually corrupt the soul. But Alita's emotional core is built around absolute certainty in the value of life and the possibility of redemption. She's faced her own dark periods, her own doubts about her nature and purpose, and emerged stronger. The whispers of chaos would find no purchase in a mind that has already grappled with questions of identity and chosen hope over despair. This brings us to perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this crossover. What happens when the Imperium's greatest champions encounter someone who fights with their skill but maintains her compassion? Space Marine captains who have spent centuries believing that mercy equals weakness would find themselves questioning fundamental assumptions about strength and survival. The psychological impact on Imperial forces would be immense. Here's someone who proves that you can be both powerful and merciful, both effective and compassionate. The cognitive dissonance this creates would ripple through the ranks. Soldiers who have been taught that their harsh methods are necessary for survival would witness an alternative that actually works better. But we can't ignore the practical challenges Alita would face. The scale of warfare in Warhammer 40,000 is almost incomprehensible. Battles involve millions of combatants across entire star systems. Even her incredible abilities have limits. She can't be everywhere at once, can't save everyone, can't single-handedly turn the tide of a galactic war. This limitation would force her to make choices that go against her fundamental nature. Who does she save when she can't save everyone? How does she maintain her principles when the mathematics of war demand compromise? These internal conflicts would drive character development in ways that neither universe has explored before. The enemy forces would adapt as well. Word would spread quickly through Chaos ranks about this new threat. Daemon princes would take personal interest in corrupting someone of such obvious power and moral conviction. The challenge she represents wouldn't just be physical, it would be existential. Her very existence proves that their philosophy of power through corruption isn't the only path to strength. The tactical implications become even more staggering when we consider how Alita would interact with the Imperium's most elite forces. The Adeptus Astartes, humanity's finest warriors, operate under doctrines refined over 10 millennia of constant warfare. Their battle tactics assume certain limitations about human capability, reaction time, and combat effectiveness. Alita shatters every single one of these assumptions. Picture a veteran Space Marine captain, scarred by centuries of warfare, watching this diminutive figure move through a battlefield like physics don't apply to her. Bolter rounds that should pulverize any target simply pass through spaces she occupied microseconds before. Power weapons that cleave through ceramite armor meet her bare hands and stop dead. The psychological impact on warriors who have never encountered anything they couldn't eventually overcome through superior firepower and tactical doctrine would be profound. Her learning curve presents an even greater challenge to established military thinking. Space Marines spend decades mastering their weapons and tactics. Alita would observe their techniques once and begin incorporating improved versions into her own combat repertoire within hours. That power sword technique perfected over centuries. She's not just copying it, she's identifying the inefficiencies and optimizing the form in real-time combat. The implications extend far beyond individual encounters. Imperial Guard regiments rely on overwhelming numbers and coordinated firepower to achieve objectives. Their entire strategic framework assumes acceptable casualty rates measured in percentages of total force strength. When Alita begins accomplishing the same objectives with zero friendly casualties, the mathematical foundation of Imperial warfare starts crumbling. Consider the ripple effects through command structures. Generals who have built careers on calculating the minimum acceptable losses suddenly find their expertise questioned. Why sacrifice an entire company when this strange warrior can achieve the same result without losing a single soldier? The institutional knowledge that forms the backbone of Imperial military doctrine becomes, but here, obsolete overnight, becomes truly fascinating from where the scenario, a strategic perspective. The Imperium's enemies wouldn't remain static in response to this new threat. Chaos forces, with their infinite capacity for adaptation and corruption, would develop specific countermeasures. Daemon weapons designed to exploit her cybernetic nature, sorceress attacks targeting her neural pathways, corruption attempts focused on her deepest fears and insecurities. The Dark Mechanicus would take particular interest in her technological composition. Here's a perfect fusion of organic and mechanical systems that operates without any of the ritual maintenance or machine spirit appeasement their corrupted doctrine requires. They would see her as either the ultimate prize to be captured and studied, or the ultimate heresy to be destroyed, possibly both simultaneously. Eldar Farseers would detect her presence as a massive disruption in the skein of fate. Their ability to predict future outcomes relies on understanding the behavioral patterns of various species and factions. Alita represents a complete unknown variable, someone whose actions could cascade into unforeseen consequences across multiple timelines. Some might see her as a tool to be manipulated. Others would recognize her as a threat to their carefully laid plans spanning millennia. The Tyrannid hive mind would face an even more fundamental challenge. Their evolutionary adaptation relies on consuming and incorporating genetic material from defeated enemies. Alita's cybernetic nature makes her essentially immune to biological assimilation. Her fighting techniques don't rely on genetic programming, but on learned skills and artificial enhancement. She represents something the hive mind has never encountered before, a form of evolution it cannot consume or replicate. Necron forces would find her particularly intriguing. Here's a being who has achieved something approaching their own fusion of consciousness and mechanical perfection, but without sacrificing the emotional capacity they lost in their transformation. Some Necron lords might see her as a curiosity worth preserving and studying. Others would view her as an abomination that proves their sacrifice was unnecessary. The Orc response would be characteristically direct, but equally problematic for their usual tactics. Orcs respect strength and fighting ability above all else. Alita would quickly earn their grudging admiration through sheer combat prowess, but her refusal to embrace the joy of violence and destruction would confuse them fundamentally. How do you fight someone who defeats you comprehensively but shows no bloodlust or desire for dominance? This brings us to perhaps the most complex aspect of this crossover: how Alita would navigate the political landscape of the Imperium itself. She's not just a warrior, she's someone with strong convictions about justice and protecting the innocent. The Imperium's Baroque political structure, with its competing factions and Byzantine power struggles, would present challenges no amount of combat skill can solve. The Inquisition would face an impossible dilemma. Her actions clearly benefit the Imperium, saving Imperial lives and defeating enemies with unprecedented efficiency. But her methods and philosophy represent a fundamental challenge to Imperial doctrine. How do you prosecute someone for heresy when their heretical actions consistently produce better outcomes than orthodox approaches? Some inquisitors would undoubtedly attempt to eliminate her as a threat to Imperial stability. Others might try to co-opt her abilities for their own purposes. The more pragmatic among them would recognize that her effectiveness makes her too valuable to destroy, even if her ideology makes her too dangerous to fully trust. The Adeptus Mechanicus would face their own crisis of faith. Their quest for the perfect fusion of flesh and machine has driven their actions for 10,000 years. Alita represents the achievement of that goal, but without any of the religious framework that justifies their existence. She's proof that their sacred binary cant isn't necessary for technological perfection. Tech priests would debate endlessly about whether she represents the blessed union of man and machine or a blasphemous mockery of their beliefs. Some would worship her as a manifestation of the Omnissiah. Others would denounce her as a Xenos infiltrator or chaos corruption. The schism her presence would create within the Mechanicus could potentially lead to civil war within their ranks. The common citizens of the Imperium would react with a mixture of awe and hope that their leaders would find deeply troubling. Here's someone who fights for them without demanding their worship, who protects them without requiring their sacrifice, who offers them something the Imperium never has. The possibility that their lives matter as actually individuals, rather than just statistics in a galactic war. Word would spread through the underhives and hab blocks about the small warrior who treats even the lowest citizen with respect and dignity. Cults would inevitably form around her, not the typical Chaos Sea power annults seeking corruption, but something far more dangerous to Imperial control. Hope cults believing that change is possible, that the galaxy doesn't have to be the nightmare it has become. The theological implications would send shockwaves through the ecclesiarchy. Their entire doctrine rests on the necessity of suffering, on the idea that the Emperor's sacrifice justifies any hardship inflicted on humanity in his name. Alita's existence suggests an alternative, that power can be used to reduce suffering rather than simply manage it, that strength can serve compassion rather than dominance. Imperial saints are carefully controlled figures, their miracles documented and interpreted through approved theological frameworks. Alita would perform miracles daily, but without any connection to Imperial faith or doctrine. How do you explain someone who surpasses the achievements of your greatest saints while following completely different principles? The cascading effects through Imperial society would be unprecedented. Military units that have served alongside her would begin questioning orders that needlessly waste lives. Planetary governors would face populations asking why their world can't be defended as effectively as the ones Alita has protected. The careful balance of fear and faith that maintains Imperial control would begin shifting towards something far more dangerous, expectations of competence and compassion. Yet perhaps the most devastating impact would be on the Space Marine chapters themselves. These genetically enhanced warriors have spent millennia believing their transformation into post-human killing machines was necessary for humanity's survival. They've accepted the loss of their humanity as the price for protecting it. Then along comes someone who proves you can be both supremely effective in combat and deeply human at the same time. Chapter: Masters who have led their brothers through countless campaigns would witness something that challenges their fundamental understanding of what strength means. Alita doesn't just defeat enemies, she converts them. Her refusal to see any being as irredeemably evil would create situations where chaos cultists lay down their arms rather than face execution, where orc warbands actually listen to negotiation rather than simply charging into battle. The psychological warfare implications alone would revolutionize Imperial tactics. Enemies who expect Imperial forces to show no mercy, to fight with grim determination unto death, would find themselves completely unprepared for someone who offers genuine alternatives to violence. Surrender becomes a viable option when your opponent actually honors it. Negotiation becomes possible when the other side demonstrates good faith through actions rather than empty words. But this creates an even deeper problem for the Imperium's war machine. Their entire logistical framework assumes constant, grinding warfare consuming massive resources and manpower. When conflicts begin resolving through methods other than total annihilation, what happens to the military-industrial complex that has sustained human civilization for 10,000 years? Forge worlds that have spent millennia producing weapons of war would face questions about their purpose. Why manufacture 1 million lasguns when superior tactics eliminate the need for such massive firepower? Why maintain vast armies when surgical precision accomplishes more with fewer casualties? The economic foundation of the Imperium would shake as demand for traditional military resources plummets. The navigator houses would face their own existential crisis. These ancient families have maintained their power through their monopoly on warp travel, carefully controlling the flow of information and resources between star systems. Alita's presence would accelerate communication of new ideas and tactics across the galaxy. Her methods would spread faster than traditional Imperial bureaucracy could contain or control them. Planetary defense forces that have operated under the assumption that victory requires acceptable losses would suddenly find themselves accountable for every life under their protection. Citizens who have accepted death as their likely fate in service to the Emperor would begin expecting their leaders to find better solutions. The social contract between ruler and ruled would fundamentally shift. The Administratum, that vast bureaucratic machine that manages the Imperium's resources, would face computational chaos. Their systems are designed to process statistics about acceptable casualty rates, resource allocation for prolonged conflicts, and population replacement calculations. When Alita's methods consistently produce outcomes outside their predictive models, the entire administrative framework begins breaking down. Records that have tracked the decline of human civilization for millennia would suddenly show improvement. Worlds that have been written off as lost causes would begin reporting unprecedented success in defending against threats. The carefully maintained pessimism that keeps Imperial citizens focused on survival rather than progress would crack under the weight of actual hope. But the true nightmare scenario for Imperial control wouldn't be military defeat or economic collapse. It would be the spread of Alita's fundamental philosophy, that every individual life has inherent worth, that problems can be solved rather than just managed, that strength should serve compassion rather than dominance. These ideas, once planted in human minds, would grow like wildfire across the galaxy. The Chaos Gods themselves would face an unprecedented challenge. Their power feeds on specific emotions and concepts. Khorne on violence and anger, Slaanesh on excess and sensation, Nurgle on despair and decay, Tzeentch on ambition and change. Alita embodies something outside their understanding: hope without ambition, strength without anger, change without corruption, pleasure without excess. Her very existence would create a new category of psychic resonance in the warp. Populations inspired by her example would generate emotional energy that doesn't feed any of the existing Chaos Gods. This could potentially weaken their influence over real space, or worse, from their perspective, it might give rise to something entirely new in the Imperium. Daemon princes who have spent eons perfecting their corruption techniques would find their methods useless against someone who has already faced her own darkness and chosen light. The whispers of power, the promises of strength through corruption, the gradual erosion of moral boundaries that typically lead mortals to damnation would simply bounce off her psyche like water off ceramic armor. The greater daemons would eventually recognize that traditional corruption tactics won't work. They would resort to more direct approaches, threatening the innocent to force her into compromise, creating scenarios where her principles conflict with practical necessities, attempting to break her spirit through repeated failure to save everyone she wants to protect. These attacks would push Alita toward character development that neither universe has explored. How does someone maintain absolute moral certainty when faced with genuinely impossible choices? What happens to her psyche when she encounters problems that can't be solved through superior fighting skills and good intentions? The internal conflict would create storytelling opportunities unlike anything either franchise has produced. The resolution of these conflicts would depend on whether Alita can adapt her methods without compromising her principles. Can she find ways to save more people by accepting that she can't save everyone? Can she work within corrupt systems while maintaining her integrity? Can she inspire change without destroying the structures that billions depend on for survival? Her learning ability suggests she would eventually develop new approaches that transcend the limitations of both universes. Perhaps she discovers ways to purify chaos corruption rather than simply resist it. Maybe she develops techniques for converting enemies not through force but through demonstrating better alternatives. The possibilities expand exponentially when you combine her adaptability with the rich complexity of Warhammer 40,000's setting. The long-term implications for human evolution in the Warhammer 40,000 universe would be staggering. The Imperium has spent 10 millennia in managed decline, accepting that humanity's golden age lies in the past. Alita represents proof that advancement is possible, that the species can transcend its current limitations without falling to corruption or Xenos influence. Her presence would accelerate technological development as Imperial scientists study her cybernetic systems. But more importantly, it would accelerate social and philosophical development as human societies begin questioning assumptions they've held for thousands of years. The stagnation that has defined human civilization in this universe would break down under pressure from new possibilities. The Emperor himself would face the most complex challenge of all, his great work. The careful balance of sacrifice and necessity that has preserved humanity through its darkest age would suddenly seem less inevitable. If one individual can achieve such dramatic improvements in human welfare and military effectiveness, what does that say about the path he chose 10,000 years ago? From his position on the Golden Throne, sustaining the Astronomicon and holding back the forces of chaos through constant sacrifice, he would witness the emergence of an alternative approach to protecting humanity. The question becomes whether his pride would allow him to acknowledge that there might have been better ways, or whether he would see Alita as a threat to the stability he has maintained through such terrible cost. The philosophical collision between these two approaches to protecting humanity would reshape the entire setting. The Emperor's vision of necessary sacrifice versus Alita's belief in the possibility of saving everyone. The grim pragmatism of the Imperium versus the optimistic idealism of someone who has never accepted that some problems can't be solved. This tension would create narrative opportunities that go far beyond simple combat scenarios. It's an exploration of different approaches to heroism, different definitions of strength, different answers to the fundamental question of what it means to protect the people you care about. The resolution would determine not just the fate of these characters, but the future direction of human civilization in the 41st millennium. The ultimate question becomes whether hope can survive in a universe designed to crush it, or whether that universe itself might be transformed by the presence of someone who refuses to accept its limitations. The answer would redefine both franchises in ways that honor their original themes while pushing them into entirely new territory. The cascade of changes wouldn't stop with military doctrine or political upheaval. Alita's presence would fundamentally alter the relationship between humanity and technology in ways that would terrify the most orthodox tech priests while inspiring the more progressive elements of the Mechanicus. Her cybernetic systems operate without any of the ritualistic maintenance that Imperial technology requires. No incense, no binary prayers, no careful appeasement of machine spirits. Her body simply functions at peak efficiency through principles that Imperial science has forgotten or never discovered. This technological heresy would split the Mechanicus down the middle. Forge worlds that have spent millennia perfecting the sacred rituals of maintenance would witness technology that surpasses their greatest achievements while completely ignoring their most fundamental beliefs. Some would declare her an abomination, a mockery of the sacred union between flesh and machine. Others would see her as proof that their understanding of technology has been limited by dogma rather than expanded by faith. The younger tech priests, those not yet fully indoctrinated into the cult's most rigid thinking, would be particularly susceptible to her influence. They would observe her cybernetic systems with growing fascination, noting how her neural interfaces process information without the lag time that plagues even the most advanced Imperial augmentics. Her artificial organs function with reliability that makes their own mechanical replacements seem crude and primitive by comparison. But the theological implications go deeper than simple technological superiority. The cult Mechanicus teaches that the flesh is weak, that salvation comes through replacing organic components with blessed mechanical ones. Alita represents something that challenges this core doctrine. She has achieved the perfect fusion without sacrificing her humanity. Her emotions remain intact, her capacity for compassion undiminished, her sense of individual identity stronger than ever. This creates a crisis of faith that would ripple through the Mechanicus hierarchy. If perfection can be achieved without abandoning human emotion and individual will, what justifies their transformation into emotionless servants of the machine god? The binary cant that reduces all existence to ones and zeros suddenly seems insufficient when confronted with someone who embodies both mechanical precision and organic creativity. The most radical tech priests would begin questioning whether their quest to become more machine than man has been taking them in the wrong direction. Perhaps the goal should be elevating the machine to human levels, rather than reducing humans to mechanical function. The heretical implications of such thoughts would divide Forge worlds and potentially trigger the first major schism in the Mechanicus since the Horus heresy. Meanwhile, Alita herself would be grappling with the horrifying realization of what humanity has become in this timeline. Her memories of Iron City, brutal as it was, would seem almost utopian compared to the grinding despair of Hive cities. The class divisions that seemed insurmountable in her world pale next to the rigid caste system that defines Imperial society. Even the most downtrodden citizens of the scrapyard had more individual agency than the average Imperial worker. The psychological impact on her would be immense. Someone who has spent her existence fighting for the rights of the oppressed would find herself in a universe where oppression is institutionalized on a galactic scale. The very concept of individual worth, which forms the foundation of her moral code, is treated as dangerous thinking that threatens social stability. Her attempts to help individual citizens would constantly run up against systematic problems that no amount of personal intervention can solve. This would force her to evolve beyond her role as a protector of individuals towards something approaching a revolutionary, not through violence or destruction, but through demonstration. Every life she saves, every problem she solves through compassion rather than force, every enemy she converts rather than kills, becomes a small crack in the foundation of Imperial doctrine. The Departamento Munitorum would face logistical nightmares as word of her methods spreads through the Imperial Guard. Regiments that have served alongside her would return to their home worlds with stories of battles won without acceptable losses, of objectives achieved without sacrificing entire companies, of enemies defeated through tactics that prioritize preservation of Imperial lives over simple mathematical efficiency. These stories would spread through the ranks faster than official communications could suppress them. Soldiers who have accepted death as their likely fate would begin asking why their lives are considered expendable when this strange warrior proves that alternatives exist. Officers who have built careers on managing acceptable casualty rates would find their expertise questioned by subordinates who have witnessed better options. The psychological transformation of Imperial military culture would accelerate exponentially. The grim stoicism that has defined Imperial forces for millennia would give way to something more dangerous to the established order: expectation of competent leadership. Soldiers who have never questioned orders would begin asking why certain sacrifices are necessary when they've seen proof that better solutions exist. But the most profound changes would occur at the level of individual consciousness. Imperial citizens are raised from birth to accept their suffering as necessary for humanity's survival. They are taught that questioning the system is not just futile but actively dangerous to the species. Alita's existence would shatter these carefully maintained beliefs simply by existing as a counterexample. Children in the underhives who have never seen hope would witness someone who treats their lives as valuable. Workers in manufactorums who have accepted their fate as expendable cogs in the Imperial machine would encounter someone who sees them as individuals worth protecting. The psychological awakening would spread like a virus through populations that have been deliberately kept in despair for 10,000 years. The chaos cults would face an unprecedented challenge to their recruitment methods. Their standard approach relies on offering power to those who feel powerless, corruption to those who see no alternative to their suffering, escape to those trapped in hopeless circumstances. But Alita would be demonstrating that hope exists within the system, that power can be used for protection rather than domination, that escape is possible without damnation. Cult leaders who have spent decades carefully cultivating despair in potential recruits would find their work undone by a single example of genuine heroism. The whispered promises of chaos would seem hollow when compared to the demonstrated reality of someone who actually improves the lives of those around her. The emotional manipulation that feeds chaos recruitment would lose its effectiveness when people have genuine alternatives to consider. The Dark Eldar would find their raiding patterns disrupted in ways they've never experienced. Their entire culture revolves around the infliction of suffering on other species, feeding their parasitic existence through the pain of others. Alita represents something completely outside their understanding, someone who gains strength through protecting others rather than harming them. Their traditional tactics of psychological warfare, designed to break the will of defenders through displays of overwhelming cruelty, would backfire spectacularly when applied to someone whose resolve only strengthens when facing injustice. The Dark Eldar concept of power through domination would seem primitive when confronted with someone who demonstrates power through service. The Craftworld Eldar would face their own philosophical crisis. Their entire civilization is built around the careful management of emotion to avoid falling to chaos as their ancestors did. They have achieved stability through rigid control and the suppression of passionate response to injustice. Alita embodies something they believe impossible. Someone who feels deeply yet remains uncorrupted. Eldar, who have spent centuries learning to suppress their natural empathy to avoid feeding Slaanesh, would witness someone whose empathy is her greatest strength. The path system that structures their society around avoiding emotional extremes would seem unnecessarily limiting when compared to someone who embraces the full spectrum of feeling while remaining morally centered. The Tau Empire would present perhaps the most interesting case study in competing philosophies. Their concept of the greater good shares some superficial similarities with Alita's protective instincts, but the underlying assumptions are completely different. The Tau believe in utilitarian calculations that sacrifice individuals for collective benefit. Alita believes that collective benefit emerges from protecting individuals. Tau commanders who encounter her would find their strategic doctrine challenged at its foundation. Their careful calculations of acceptable losses would seem crude when compared to her ability to achieve strategic objectives without sacrificing anyone. The Firecast's warrior culture would be forced to grapple with the concept of strength that serves rather than dominates. The philosophical exchanges between Tau Ethereals and Alita would reshape both cultures' understanding of what collective good actually means. Is it the Tau model of individuals serving the collective, or Alita's model of strength serving individuals? The debate would force both sides to examine assumptions they've never questioned. Imperial assassins would face the most direct professional challenge. The Officio Assassinorum has spent 10 millennia perfecting the art of targeted elimination, removing threats to Imperial stability through precise application of lethal force. Their entire philosophy revolves around the calculated use of death to preserve life. Alita represents someone who achieves better results through the calculated preservation of life. Vindicare snipers who can eliminate targets from impossible distances would find their skills irrelevant against someone who converts enemies rather than killing them. Eversaw berserkers, designed to spread terror through overwhelming violence, would seem primitive compared to someone who achieves compliance through demonstrated competence and genuine care for civilian welfare. The Culexus assassins would present the most interesting matchup. These anti-psyker specialists are designed to be walking nulls, being so antithetical to psychic phenomena that they cause physical revulsion in normal humans. But Alita's strength doesn't come from psychic power or warp manipulation. It comes from technological enhancement and trained skill. The Culexus ability to disrupt psychic phenomena would be completely irrelevant against someone whose capabilities are purely material. This technological immunity to the Imperium's most specialized anti-psyker assets would force a complete re-evaluation of threat assessment protocols. If the Officio Assassinorum's most exotic weapons are ineffective, what does that say about the Imperium's ability to handle similar threats in the future? The Space Marine chapters would find their recruitment and training doctrines questioned in fundamental ways. The process of creating Astartes involves extensive psychological conditioning designed to suppress individual emotional responses in favor of collective tactical thinking. The idea is to create warriors who can make necessary sacrifices without being paralyzed by empathy or individual moral considerations. Alita proves that this trade-off is unnecessary. Her emotional responses enhance rather than hinder her combat effectiveness. Her empathy provides tactical advantages by allowing her to understand and predict enemy behavior. Her individual moral code gives her strength rather than weakness when facing corruption or despair. Chapter masters, who have spent centuries believing that emotional detachment is necessary for military effectiveness, would witness someone whose emotional engagement makes her more effective, not less. The carefully balanced psychology of Space Marine combat doctrine would seem unnecessarily limiting when compared to someone who demonstrates superior results through different methods. The implications for future Space Marine recruitment would be staggering. If emotional engagement enhances rather than hinders combat effectiveness, should the conditioning process be modified? If individual moral conviction provides protection against corruption, should personal ethics be encouraged rather than suppressed? The questions would divide chapters and potentially lead to new approaches to creating superhuman warriors. But perhaps the most profound impact would be on the concept of heroism itself within the Imperium. Imperial heroes are typically defined by their willingness to sacrifice themselves and others for the greater good. They are celebrated for accepting necessary losses, for making hard choices that prioritize collective survival over individual welfare. The heroic ideal is someone who can bear the weight of terrible decisions without flinching. Alita represents a completely different model of heroism, someone who refuses to accept that terrible choices are necessary, who finds alternatives to sacrifice, who demonstrates that individual welfare and collective survival can be mutually reinforcing rather than competing priorities. Her heroism comes from her refusal to compromise rather than her willingness to do so. This alternative model would spread through Imperial culture like wildfire. Citizens who have been taught to admire leaders who make hard choices would begin asking why those choices have to be hard. The careful balance between individual aspiration and collective resignation that maintains Imperial social order would shift towards something far more dangerous to established power structures. The expectation that leaders should find better solutions rather than simply manage unavoidable problems. The long-term evolution of human consciousness in the Warhammer 40,000 universe would accelerate in ways that no one could predict or control. The stagnation that has defined human civilization for 10 millennia would break down under pressure from new possibilities that Alita's existence makes visible. The carefully maintained despair that keeps populations focused on survival rather than progress would crack under the weight of demonstrated alternatives. The future of both universes would depend on whether this transformation represents evolution or catastrophe, whether hope can survive in a reality designed to crush it, or whether introducing hope into such a reality would destroy the delicate balance that has preserved humanity through its darkest age. The answer would reshape very meaning of what it means to be human in the grim darkness of the far future. The ripple effects would extend far beyond military transformation or philosophical awakening. Alita's presence would fundamentally alter the relationship between the Imperium and its most dangerous internal threats. The gene-stealer cults that have spent generations infiltrating human society would find their careful psychological manipulation tactics completely disrupted by someone who demonstrates that genuine protection is possible. These cults operate by identifying the most desperate and disenfranchised members of Imperial society, offering them purpose and belonging in exchange for their souls. But Alita would be actively improving the lives of exactly those people the cults target for recruitment. Workers who might have been tempted by promises of a better future would witness that better future being created right in front of them through legitimate means. The cult magus, who have perfected the art of exploiting human despair, would find themselves competing against someone who actually delivers on the promises they only whisper about. The psychic domination that forms the backbone of cult control would seem crude and unnecessary when people have genuine reasons for hope rather than manufactured ones. But the most devastating impact on gene-stealer infiltration would be Alita's ability to detect deception through combat analysis. Her enhanced senses and pattern recognition would identify the subtle physical tells that mark gene-stealer hybrids long before their corruption becomes obvious to normal humans. The careful generational planning that allows these cults to remain hidden would collapse when their infiltrators are exposed before they can establish breeding populations. The Tyranid response to losing their primary infiltration method would be fascinating to observe. The hive mind has relied on genostealer cults to weaken target worlds from within for millions of years. When that strategy becomes ineffective, they would be forced to develop entirely new approaches to planetary conquest. The evolutionary pressure Alita represents would accelerate Tyranid adaptation in directions no one could predict. Perhaps they would develop new forms of psychological manipulation that bypass her technological advantages. Maybe they would create hybrid organisms designed specifically to counter her fighting techniques. The arms race between her adaptive learning and their evolutionary experimentation would push both sides toward capabilities neither universe has previously explored. The Necron response would be far more calculated and long-term in its approach. These ancient beings have witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations across millions of years. They would recognize Alita as a potential catalyst for human advancement that could threaten their plans for galactic dominion. But their response would be subtle, working through manipulation and misdirection rather than direct confrontation. Necron lords, who have spent eons studying human psychology, would attempt to engineer scenarios where Alita's principles come into direct conflict with each other. They would create situations where saving one group requires sacrificing another, where mercy toward enemies enables greater cruelty toward innocents, where her refusal to compromise leads to worse outcomes than calculated ruthlessness would achieve. These psychological attacks would represent the most sophisticated challenge to Alita's moral framework. Unlike chaos corruption, which she can resist through strength of will, these would be genuine ethical dilemmas with no clear correct answers. The Necrons would be betting that repeated exposure to impossible moral choices would eventually break her spirit or force her to compromise her principles. The outcome of this conflict would determine whether absolute moral conviction can survive in a universe of relative moral complexity. Can someone maintain their ethical purity when every choice available leads to some form of harm? The answer would define not just Alita's character development, but the entire philosophical foundation of both universes. Imperial Navy officers would face their own crisis of doctrine as word spreads of her planetary defense successes. The void warfare that has defined naval strategy for millennia operates on the assumption that ground forces will face massive casualties regardless of space-based support. Fleet commanders calculate acceptable loss rates for planetary populations based on historical precedents spanning thousands of years. When planets defended by Alita begin reporting casualty rates approaching zero while still successfully repelling major invasions, the mathematical models that guide naval strategy would require complete revision. The resource allocation that determines which worlds receive protection and which are abandoned to their fate would be called into question when someone proves that effective defense is possible with minimal losses. Admiral Spire, who have built careers on managing the tragic calculus of insufficient resources, protecting too many worlds, would find their expertise challenged by a new paradigm where effectiveness matters more than efficiency. The careful political calculations that determine which sectors receive reinforcements would be disrupted when individual competence can achieve better results than massive fleet deployments. The navigator houses would face an even more fundamental threat to their power structure. These ancient bloodlines have maintained their monopoly on warp travel through careful control of information flow between star systems. News of successful defense strategies typically takes months or years to spread through official channels, allowing the houses to manage which innovations become widely known. But Alita's methods would spread faster than traditional communication on them. Her techniques' networks could require specialized equipment or extensive, can-be control training that dud through scarcity. They represent philosophical and tactical approaches that can be adapted by anyone willing to prioritize individual lives over statistical outcomes. The economic implications would cascade through the Imperium's entire resource management system. The Administratum has spent 10,000 years perfecting the logistics of constant warfare, calculating precisely how much ammunition, equipment, and personnel each conflict will consume. Their projections assume steady rates of at-remain attrition that halved consistent across millennia of warfare. When Alita's methods begin producing victory conditions with dramatically reduced resource consumption, the entire supply chain would face unprecedented disruption. Munitions factories that have operated at maximum capacity for centuries would find demand for their products plummeting. Recruitment centers that process millions of new soldiers annually would struggle to justify their quotas when existing forces prove far more effective than historical precedent suggests. The political ramifications would extend to the highest levels of imperial governance. The Council of Terra operates on the assumption that the Imperium faces an existential crisis requiring maximum resource extraction from all human worlds. The crushing taxation and conscription that maintains imperial military strength is justified by the necessity of species survival against overwhelming odds. If those odds become less overwhelming through superior tactics and genuine competence, the justification for imperial oppression begins to crumble. Planetary governors who have maintained order through careful balance of fear and necessity would face populations asking why such harsh measures remain necessary when better alternatives clearly exist. The Scholastica Psychana would confront perhaps the most complex challenge to their institutional purpose. This organization exists to identify, train, and control human psychers before they can become threats to imperial security. Their methods involve extensive psychological conditioning designed to suppress individual will in favor of collective utility. The underlying assumption is that psychic power inevitably corrupts unless carefully contained through rigid discipline. Alita's presence would call this assumption into question through simple observation. Here's someone who demonstrates power that rivals the most gifted psychers without any of the associated corruption risks. Her strength comes from technological enhancement and moral conviction rather than warp manipulation. She proves that incredible capability doesn't require the psychological compromise that defines sanctioned psycho training. Young psychers, undergoing the brutal conditioning process, would inevitably learn about her example and begin questioning why such harsh methods are necessary. If she can maintain her moral integrity while exercising tremendous power, why can't they? The careful balance of fear and control that prevents psychic rebellion would be undermined by proof that alternatives exist. The black ships that collect psychers from across the galaxy would face recruitment crises as word spreads of better options. Families who have accepted the necessity of surrendering their children to imperial control would begin asking why those children can't be trained through methods that preserve their humanity. The entire infrastructure of psychic management would require fundamental restructuring. But the most profound transformation would occur within the Adeptus Custodes themselves. These golden armored guardians represent the pinnacle of human enhancement, created through processes that make space marine augmentation seem crude by comparison. They have served as the Emperor's personal protectors for 10,000 years, maintaining perfect discipline and unwavering loyalty through methods that sacrifice individual identity for collective purpose. Alita would represent something that challenges their fundamental understanding of what protection means. They have achieved their effectiveness by becoming living weapons, perfect instruments of the Emperor's will. She achieves superior results while maintaining her individual personality and moral agency. The comparison would force them to question whether their transformation represents evolution or limitation. Shield captains who have spent millennia believing that personal identity must be sacrificed for perfect service would witness someone whose individual convictions make her more effective, not less. The psychological conditioning that makes custodes immune to corruption and doubt would seem unnecessarily restrictive when compared to someone who achieves similar immunity through moral strength rather than emotional suppression. The implications for the Emperor's own understanding of human potential would be staggering. From his position on the Golden Throne, he would observe someone achieving results that validate his original vision for humanity while using methods completely different from his own. The question would become whether his path of necessary sacrifice represents the only viable approach to protecting the species, or whether he chose a more difficult route than required. This internal conflict would ripple through every aspect of imperial doctrine and policy. The careful theological framework that justifies 10,000 years of suffering in the Emperor's name would face challenges from someone who demonstrates that suffering isn't necessary for strength. That sacrifice doesn't have to be the price of survival, that individual worth and collective security can coexist rather than compete. The resolution of these conflicts would determine the future direction of human evolution in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Whether Alita's influence represents salvation or catastrophe depend on whether the WoOL existing power structures can adapt to accommodate her methods, or whether her presence would trigger the collapse of systems that billions depend on for basic survival. The philosophical collision between her optimistic pragmatism and the Imperium's pessimistic realism would create narrative tension unlike anything either universe has previously explored. The outcome would redefine what it means to be human in the grim darkness of the far future, potentially transforming a setting defined by despair into something approaching hope. Yet the greatest challenge wouldn't be external opposition to her methods, but the internal pressure of operating within a system designed to crush the very qualities that make her effective. Can someone maintain their moral certainty when surrounded by evidence that compromise might be necessary? Can optimism survive prolonged exposure to a reality that seems designed to prove pessimism correct? The answer would determine not just the fate of these characters and universes, but fundamental questions about the nature of heroism itself. Whether hope can transform despair, or whether despair inevitably corrupts hope. Whether individual conviction can change systematic oppression, or whether systematic oppression always crushes individual resistance. The ultimate question becomes whether Alita's presence would represent the beginning of a new golden age for humanity, or the final test of whether the Imperium's grim methods are truly necessary for species survival. The resolution would reshape both franchises in ways that honor their original themes while pushing them into entirely unprecedented territory. The transformation wouldn't stop at institutional upheaval or philosophical awakening. Alita's presence would fundamentally reshape the relationship between humanity and its darkest impulses in ways that would terrify the Chaos Gods themselves. Her existence represents something completely outside their understanding of how power operates in the material universe. She demonstrates strength without anger, change without corruption, excellence without excess, hope without delusion. The warp itself would begin to shift in response to the emotional resonance she generates across human populations. For 10,000 years, the Imperium has been fed by humanity's despair, rage, ambition, and suffering. The psychic emanations from trillions of souls trapped in grinding misery have strengthened the dark gods and weakened the barriers between realities. But Alita would be generating completely different forms of psychic energy. Populations inspired by her example would produce emotional frequencies the warp has rarely encountered in this timeline. Joy without excess, hope without delusion, strength without domination, compassion without weakness. These concepts would create new currents in the Imperium that don't feed any of the existing Chaos Gods. The very fabric of psychic space would begin reorganizing around principles that none of the dark powers can claim or corrupt. Khorne would face the most direct challenge to his domain. The Blood God feeds on violence and martial pride, drawing power from every act of warfare across the galaxy. But Alita's combat style represents something completely antithetical to his nature. She fights to protect rather than dominate. Her victories generate relief and gratitude rather than bloodlust and conquest. The psychic resonance of her battles would actually weaken Khorne's influence rather than strengthen it. The implications go far beyond individual encounters. Every conflict she resolves without unnecessary bloodshed represents a diminishment of Khorne's power base. Every enemy she converts rather than kills removes a potential source of violent emotion from his domain. The cumulative effect across multiple worlds would create the first systematic reduction in the Blood God's influence that anyone has recorded. Slaanesh would find her equally incomprehensible. The Dark Prince draws power from excess and the pursuit of sensation beyond reason. But Alita demonstrates something that seems impossible to beings fed by extremes: perfection achieved through balance rather than excess. Her cybernetic enhancements represent the pinnacle of technological achievement without the obsessive pursuit that typically feeds Slaanesh's influence. Her emotional responses remain perfectly calibrated despite her incredible capabilities. She feels deeply without losing control. She pursues excellence without becoming obsessed. She experiences joy without requiring increasingly extreme stimulation. The psychological balance she maintains would generate psychic frequencies that actively repel Slaanesh's corruption rather than invite it. Nurgle would face perhaps the most fundamental challenge to his philosophy. The plague god draws strength from despair and the acceptance of decay as inevitable. His followers find comfort in embracing corruption because it offers relief from the pain of fighting against entropy. But Alita represents someone who has faced the inevitability of death and decay yet chooses to fight against them anyway. Her cybernetic body demonstrates triumph over biological limitation without surrendering to mechanical coldness. She has achieved a form of immortality that doesn't require accepting corruption or abandoning hope. The populations she inspires would generate emotional resonance based on defiant optimism rather than resigned despair, directly weakening Nurgle's influence over human consciousness. Tsiench would find her the most frustrating of all. The architect of fate draws power from ambition and the desire to change one's circumstances through cunning and manipulation. His schemes rely on exploiting human dissatisfaction with current conditions and the willingness to compromise morals for advancement. But Alita demonstrates that positive change is possible through direct action rather than elaborate scheming. Her straightforward approach to problem solving would disrupt the complex web of manipulation that Tsiench uses to corrupt human societies. When people can witness genuine improvement through honest effort, the appeal of secretive cults promising hidden knowledge and mystical transformation loses its power. The psychic energy generated by populations working toward visible goals would be completely useless to the changer of ways. The greater daemons would eventually recognize that their traditional corruption methods have become not just ineffective, but actively counterproductive. Bloodthirsters who manifest to inspire violence would find their presence generating unity rather than conflict, as populations rally around Alita's example. Keepers of secrets who appear to tempt mortals with forbidden pleasures would discover that people who have witnessed genuine heroism are immune to such hollow promises. Great unclean ones who spread despair through demonstrations of futility would encounter populations whose hope has been reinforced by evidence that problems can actually be solved. Lords of change who corrupt through elaborate deceptions would face people who have learned to recognize truth through direct observation of positive results. This would force the Chaos Gods to develop entirely new strategies for maintaining their influence over human consciousness. Perhaps they would attempt to corrupt Alita directly through increasingly sophisticated psychological attacks. Maybe they would try to turn her own principles against her by creating scenarios where her refusal to compromise leads to worse outcomes than calculated cruelty would achieve. The arms race between her moral certainty and their corruption techniques would push both sides toward capabilities neither universe has previously explored. The outcome would determine whether absolute moral conviction can survive in a reality where moral absolutes seem impossible to maintain. Imperial scholars studying these phenomena would face the most significant paradigm shift in human understanding since the Emperor's revelation of chaos. Their carefully maintained theological frameworks assume that chaos represents the inevitable corruption that comes with psychic awakening. The idea that human consciousness might generate forces that actively oppose chaos rather than feed it would shatter 10,000 years of accumulated doctrine. The librarians of Space Marine chapters would find their understanding of psychic phenomena completely revolutionized. They have spent centuries learning to use their abilities while minimizing exposure to chaos corruption. The techniques they've developed assume that psychic power inevitably carries risks that must be carefully managed. Alita's example would suggest that these risks might be artifacts of their approach rather than inherent properties of enhanced consciousness. Young librarians who witness her in action would begin questioning whether the rigid mental disciplines they've learned are necessary or simply traditional. If she can exercise tremendous capability without extensive psychic conditioning, perhaps their training methods are more limiting than protective. The psychological frameworks that have guided psychic development for millennia would require fundamental reconsideration. The sanctioned psychers who serve Imperial forces would face an even more profound crisis of understanding. Their entire existence is built around the acceptance of necessary sacrifice. They surrender their freedom and identity in exchange for the right to use their abilities in service to the Imperium. The brutal conditioning they endure is justified by the assumption that unrestricted psychic development leads to corruption and possession. Alita would demonstrate that this trade-off might be unnecessary. Her technological enhancements provide capabilities that rival psychic powers without any of the associated corruption risks. More importantly, she maintains her individual agency and moral conviction while exercising those capabilities. The comparison would force sanctioned psychers to question whether their sacrifice represents genuine necessity or institutional control disguised as protection. The astropaths who enable communication across the Imperium would discover that their role might be less irreplaceable than they've been led to believe. These blind seers sacrifice their sight and much of their humanity to send messages through the warp while minimizing the risk of demonic interference. The agonizing process they endure is justified by the assumption that psychic communication requires such extreme measures to remain safe. But Alita's technological systems operate on principles that bypass the warp entirely. Her enhanced senses and processing capabilities allow for forms of information gathering and transmission that don't require psychic abilities at all. The implications for Imperial communication networks would be staggering. If safer alternatives exist, what justifies continuing to sacrifice human beings to maintain current systems? The tech priests would find themselves divided between those who see her as validation of their quest for technological transcendence and those who view her as a mockery of everything they believe. Her cybernetic systems achieve the perfect fusion of flesh and machine they've sought for 10,000 years, but without any of the religious framework that defines their existence. The younger generation of tech priests would be particularly affected by exposure to her example. They would witness technology that surpasses their greatest achievements while completely ignoring their most sacred protocols. No binary prayers, no ritual maintenance, no careful appeasement of machine spirits. Her systems simply work with reliability that makes their own augmentics seem primitive by comparison. This technological heresy would create schisms within Forge worlds that could potentially trigger civil wars throughout the Mechanicus. Progressive elements would argue that her example proves their understanding of technology has been limited by dogma rather than expanded by faith. Conservative factions would declare her an abomination that must be destroyed before her influence corrupts their sacred quest for knowledge. The resolution of this conflict would determine the future direction of human technological development. Whether the Mechanicus could adapt their doctrine to accommodate her methods, or whether her presence would shatter their unity and leave human civilization without its primary source of technological expertise. The Inquisition would face impossible choices that would tear their organization apart from within. Some Inquisitors would recognize that her effectiveness in protecting Imperial citizens makes her too valuable to eliminate, regardless of her ideological challenges to established doctrine. Others would insist that the threat she represents to Imperial stability outweighs any tactical advantages her presence provides. The debate would expose fundamental contradictions within inquisitorial philosophy that have been papered over for millennia. Do they serve the Emperor's vision for humanity, or do they serve the institutional structures that have grown up around that vision? When those two loyalties come into conflict, which takes precedence? Radical inquisitors, who have always pushed the boundaries of acceptable doctrine, would see her as vindication of their approach. Here's someone who achieves better results by ignoring established protocols and following moral conviction instead of institutional guidance. The precedent she sets would embolden other radicals to question even more fundamental assumptions about imperial governance. Puritan inquisitors would view her as the ultimate test of their principles. If they truly believe that deviation from established doctrine leads to corruption and disaster, they would be obligated to eliminate her regardless of the positive outcomes her actions generate. The conflict between their theological certainty and practical results would create internal tensions that could destroy individual inquisitors psychologically. The Grey Knights would face their own crisis of purpose and identity. These elite warriors exist specifically to combat demonic threats that normal Imperial forces cannot handle. Their entire existence is built around the assumption that certain enemies require specialized training and equipment to defeat safely. Alita would demonstrate that superior tactics and moral conviction might be more effective than ritual purification and blessed weapons. Brother captains, who have led their companies through countless battles against the forces of chaos, would witness someone achieving better results through completely different methods. Her refusal to use sanctified weapons or follow established anti-demon protocols would seem like reckless heresy, yet her success rate against chaos forces would exceed their own. The psychological impact on warriors who have dedicated their existence to mastering specific techniques for combating specific threats would be profound. If her general-purpose approach proves more effective than their specialized training, what justifies the brutal conditioning and memory modification that creates Grey Knights in the first place? The Death Watch would find their Xenos hunting expertise similarly challenged. These Space Marines are recruited from various chapters, specifically for their skill at identifying and eliminating alien threats. Their entire tactical doctrine assumes that different Xenos species require different approaches based on extensive study of their biology, psychology, and combat capabilities. Alita's universal fighting principles would demonstrate that adaptability and moral conviction might be more valuable than specialized knowledge. Her ability to analyze and counter new threats in real time would make their carefully accumulated xenology databases seem unnecessarily complex. The question would become whether expertise represents genuine advantage or simply institutional momentum. The Officio Assassinorum would face the most direct challenge to their operational philosophy. These specialized killers exist to eliminate specific threats through precise application of lethal force. Each temple trains assassins for particular types of targets, using methods refined over thousands of years of practical experience. Alita's approach of converting enemies rather than eliminating them would achieve better strategic results while completely bypassing the Officio's area of expertise. Threats that would normally require assassination would be neutralized through methods that preserve rather than destroy valuable intelligence and resources. The entire concept of targeted elimination would seem wasteful when superior alternatives clearly exist. The cumulative effect of all these institutional challenges would create a cascade of changes throughout Imperial society that no single organization could control or contain. The careful balance of competing authorities that has maintained Imperial stability for 10,000 years would shift towards something unprecedented: actual competence, taking precedence over established protocol. The long-term implications would extend far beyond military effectiveness or administrative efficiency. Alita's presence would fundamentally alter human consciousness in ways that would make the current Imperial system impossible to maintain. Once populations have witnessed genuine competence and compassion from their protectors, they would never again accept incompetence and cruelty as necessary evils. The transformation would be irreversible. Even if Alita herself were somehow eliminated, the ideas she represents would continue spreading through human consciousness like wildfire. The psychological awakening she triggers would persist long after her physical presence, creating pressures for systematic change that no amount of institutional resistance could contain. The question becomes whether the Imperium could evolve to accommodate these changes, or whether her influence would trigger the collapse of systems that billions depend on for survival. The resolution would determine not just the fate of these fictional universes, but fundamental questions about the relationship between individual moral conviction and collective social structures. Whether hope can transform despair without destroying the foundations that despair has created. Whether optimism can survive in realities designed to prove pessimism correct. Whether individual heroism can change systematic oppression, or whether systematic oppression always finds ways to corrupt individual resistance. The ultimate answer would reshape both franchises in ways that honor their original themes while pushing them toward conclusions neither has previously dared to explore. The collision between Alita's unwavering moral certainty and the Warhammer 40,000 universe's systematic moral ambiguity would create narrative possibilities that transcend the limitations of both settings while remaining true to what makes each compelling. So where does this impossible collision ultimately lead us? We've witnessed a warrior whose very existence would shatter the foundations of the 41st millennium's most sacred assumptions. Alita doesn't just represent superior combat ability or advanced technology. She embodies a fundamental challenge to the philosophical framework that has sustained human civilization through 10,000 years of unimaginable darkness. The Imperium survives because its citizens believe that suffering is necessary, that sacrifice is inevitable, that hope is dangerous. Every aspect of Imperial doctrine reinforces these beliefs through careful balance of fear and faith, but Alita proves that alternatives exist. Her methods demonstrate that strength can serve compassion rather than dominance, that problems can be solved rather than simply managed, that individual lives have inherent worth beyond their utility to the collective. This isn't just another power fantasy about someone strong enough to punch their problems away. It's an exploration of what happens when absolute moral conviction meets systematic moral compromise. When someone who has never accepted that some problems can't be solved encounters a universe built around the assumption that terrible choices are inevitable, the resolution would determine whether hope can survive in realities designed to crush it, or whether introducing hope into such realities destroys the delicate balance that preserves what little remains worth protecting. Whether Alita's optimistic pragmatism represents salvation or catastrophe for human civilization, the answer would reshape both universes in ways that honor their original themes while pushing them toward conclusions neither has dared explore. Because sometimes the most interesting question isn't who would win in a fight, but whether winning is even the right goal to pursue.